record spins in the living room, filling the air with warm familiarity and sweet serenity from an era removed. Yet Carter Peachman holds no memory of it. His wedding's on. Hanging from the walls, leaving space for nothing else, are gigantic posters of early silent films, adorned with the brightest stars to grace the silver screen, for which he was the writer for, though one may not have known that. History pushed aside, much like the abundance of female directors at the time, the writers were to receive peanuts and alcoholism. Mr. Peachman rests in his rocking chair, situated in the corner beside a desk, with a 1933 forest green Smith Corona typewriter on top, puffing on a bold cigarette, sending the smoke circling around the cramped apartment as his only solace in old age. His support worker, Natalie, in the distant kitchen, preparing lunch, tomato soup. I sit across from him on the edge of a plush couch so as not to fall into it, with a pen and paper in hand, and as the crackle of the music fades and is replaced with the bubbling of the soup, I ask, "What was your interest in writing for film?" Eyes wide with enthusiasm, and a grin spread among the wrinkles of time, the natural storyteller shines, feeling more alive than he has in months, or even years. As a young man, he would roam the streets of New York, particularly Broadway, taking in the glamour of the spectators, which he would become on his 13th birthday, a gift from his parents, resulting in a week of stale bread for meals. Whisked away into fantastical lands and intimate portrayals of human nature, Peachman felt his calling and burnt the midnight oil, crafting tales of duplicity and love and triumph before bringing them to life for friends and family. "During a storm," he tells me with great urgency, "is the best time to write, with its fiery vengeance that intrigues." Furthering his interest, he became a stagehand for several productions, where he met writers and directors and actors who played key roles in getting his debut play featured off-Broadway at age 17, which was followed up a year later with the release of his first novel. And it was during this first play where he met his wife, Meredith, her curly red hair glistening underneath the stage lights, creating a halo. They married 2 years later. I shifted my eyes towards the record player across from me, sorrow and empathy filling my heart with pain as memories flash before this man, yet that same brain deceives him further. His speech slows as he continues. Films caught the attention of mesmerized audiences that were too expensive to shoot in New York, with Edison and his endless tirade of lawsuits directed at the blooming artists infatuated with this latest display of life, his words deep in extravagance. This art form intrigued Peachman. The raw emotion of the story, coupled with the intimate masking of the camera as it cornered its subject in the frame, forcing the viewer to feel as the characters feel, was real. And as the industry shifted towards the West Coast, he and his wife soon moved there too. Lavish parties and unbridled ego scatter the remnants of California in search of stardom, and for Peachman, his craft, sought after by studios clamoring over one another for their golden ticket to the pearly gates of wealth. Carter shifts in his chair, uncomfortable and filled with angst as he waits, impatient, for his lunch, forgetting entirely the reason I was there. Natalie fixes the dining room table before helping Peachman out of his seat, who slugs his way to eat, his eyes never moving, fixated on the ground so as to not miss a step. I moved beside Carter at the table, who calls for Natalie, desiring a whiskey, though she ignores him, instead asking if I wanted anything, to which I declined. "What good are you if I can't get a drink?" he spits. My worried and star-struck eyes catch Peachman's attention as he describes in excruciating detail the shape of my features and the emotions inside that I had not expressed. My hands tremor as I attempt to write, his gaze stuck on the scribbles that lined the page. He heaves a sigh. "You know," he begins, before taking a dainty sip of his soup, "I used to write a lot. Can't seem to think of things lately, though. Tragic, isn't it?" Taking another small sip of his soup, he relishes in a story about true tragedy, in the form of hostile work environments at the hands of studio executives, taking the lot and the credit from those more worthy. The only thing that was truly mine, that no one could take from me, were my words, and even they tried. He ate slowly, taking each spoonful with agonizing precision, and leaving no room for me to interject with questions, instead lambasting me with confusion and fury. Natalie pokes her head into the dining room and gives me a quizzitive expression, alerting me that something may be off with Carter, who cranes his neck to look out the window after finishing his lunch. The clouds are sparse, puffy, and vibrant, like snow as they cascade along the bright blue sky. A bird chirps, taking Carter's attention away, and follows it before it perches itself on a tree and sings a song that brings Peachman to close his eyes and drift to another plane. His glance shifts inwards to the empty bowl in front of him, and, agitated, shouts for Natalie to bring him his soup. She barrels into the dining room, assuring him he was fed, and they bicker, though soon after, Peachman forgets altogether what the fight is about, and turns to face me again, requesting we continue our conversation in the living room. Bouncing off the walls, his voice carries itself with boisterous conviviality as the words swirl around me, cocooning in their warmth. A fight breaks out in a conference room between Peachman and an executive, forcing him to trim dialogue of a character to fit the narrative structured around the actor chosen. During his acceptance speech for the Pulitzer in 1928, the one sitting on a bookshelf near the back of the room, he catches a glimpse of a woman's leg as she shows it off for him, and he stumbles over his words, though he never lets slip who it was. He glances towards the ceiling and apologizes to Meredith. As the afternoon continues, his stories become jumbled, sporadic in nature, filled with inconsistencies and incoherent mumblings, soothed only by his cigarettes as he takes deep, heavy drags. My lungs hurt watching him. Natalie enters the living room to check on things, to which Carter yells at her. If she wants to be helpful, he squawks, she should fix him a drink. An entreaty she again ignores. Stories come and go, some with no endings, while others fill him with frustration as his mind takes control of his words and pulls them out from his mouth. I take a few notes during the story. A vacation he and Meredith took, and when they returned were interrogated by the studio of a supposed extramarital affair, while he wrangles his thoughts and notices my writing. You know, he begins, before pulling a drag of his cigarette, allowing the smoke to occupy his lungs, and finally releasing the thick cloud. I used to write a lot. Can't seem to think of things lately, though. Tragic, isn't it? A pit in my heart opens wide, consuming my soul and tearing me apart. He looks into my eyes, confused, unable to decipher my emotional state, and begins to look everywhere but at me. His attention goes back into his head, and as he sheds a tear before cursing at himself for forgetting such an easy detail, and one he would never be able to tell. As his voice rises in exasperation, the once calm but vehement man, now hostile, sends Natalie rushing to his side in an attempt to conciliate. I am frozen, not sure what to make of it, and also unsure if there is anything I can do, until he pierces my eyes with a look of horror and sadness, before collecting his thoughts and asking me to leave, that we can finish the interview at a later date. The lifeless walls of a hospital stain the recesses of Peachman's mind for the coming months as he enters a revolving door of despair. My life continues as normal. Issues published, articles written, late-night coffee dates, tedious meetings along a burly oak table in a cramped room as smoke fills the space, taking me back. I sit at my desk and write, Peachman unaware of my whereabouts while he lingers in my head, trailing behind like a puppy with no home and no purpose. My story is rare to be axed, a thought that crosses me daily, and one that has never before, until a telephone call comes through our switchboard, and as the dark clouds roll in and the rain begins, I set out. Stale cigarettes escape through the cracks of the door, and the stench slaps me in the face as Natalie swings it open. Peachman, now in a wheelchair, stares out the window in the living room at the rain pelting the glass, unaware of my presence, his hair wild and skin droopy. Cautious, I waltz towards the couch and place my pen and notepad on the coffee table, taking in the photos sprawled on top with names and dates written with haste. Dust covers the typewriter that rests on the desk, while the carpet underneath remains untouched. Knickknacks that were scattered about are gone, replaced with a void on the bookshelves and the mantel. He startles himself when he turns to me, his face twisted as he reaches into the depths of his memory to put a name to the face in front of him. A smile crawls across his face as he recognizes me, excited for us to continue our interview, though he never addresses me by name. We break into small talk, and as he wheels closer, the act taking the air out of his lungs, which gives him the time to think of a response to my questions. His chair bumps the coffee table, and lets go a huff, proclaiming he rams into things all the time. A natural klutz. Natalie brings us each a cup of coffee, cream and sugar for me, and black for Carter, with 2 ice cubes melting before he takes his first sip. Thunder shakes the house, sending him into a frenzy, unnerved by the nature surrounding him and the inability to cope with what fascinated him as a young man. As he settles, lighting a cigarette and puffing as though his life depended on it, he glances at the half-full cup on the table and shouts, voice vibrating off the barren walls, thanking Natalie. Finishing his smoke, he motions for me to begin, and with my notepad rested on my crossed legs, I glance at my paper with my questions written and ask, how did your success change your perception of the world around you? His speech, though choppy and sedated, creating a prolonged exposure of time between questions, is still elaborate in essence, with fluid vocabulary and a punch for the dramatic. Every few minutes, Natalie enters the room again and again to check on us, her silence permeating the air, yet Peachman pays her no mind, as though she doesn't exist. He begins a story about returning home for the holidays, visiting friends and family with Meredith in Maine. As he continues, I ponder the question, and the irony of it given the circumstances, and he takes note, stopping himself to interrogate me for being absent-minded, however laughing it off. I apologize and allow him to carry on. Soon after, he pulls back, this time beating himself up, his voice rising, for saying Maine. He has never been to Maine, he tells me. In 1933, for the novel To the Concourse, he participated in a book signing in Portland, Maine. Resuming, he becomes dreary with every passing minute, his brain analyzing his thoughts at the pace of a snail. His annoyance increases at the same time, though he glances around the room, unsure why that is. In the kitchen, while Natalie prepares lunch, she bumps a pan, sending it crashing to the ground, startling Carter. His eyes widen with worry as he twists his body in the wheelchair to peer around the corner before exhaling with relief. You know Meredith, he stammers. Always a bit of a klutz when she drinks. That's why we had to move all of our things off the bookshelves. Jumping off from the comment, he delves into a story, or multiple stories mashed into one, about Meredith, the woman who hadn't even let a drop of alcohol touch her lips, except when kissing Peachman. And her drinking. One particular instance he recalls fondly was the 1931 Academy Awards. During the after-party, she fell into a table with drinks flying around and drenching director Frank Capra. Dripping, he hovers, holding his Oscar and scolding her. Keeping my emotions under wraps was no use, as my face and mind swirled with heartache, though even with his blank eyes staring at me, he does not pick up if he even understands the nature of the story. Peachman sits at the table, relishing in his grilled cheese sandwich, his lips smacking with pleasure. I glance into the kitchen to find Natalie making soup, expecting her to bring a bowl for Carter, only to see her hunched over the counter, slurping it herself when looking back. She notices my wandering eyes and informs me Carter can't eat soup anymore, that his fingers are too nimble to grasp the spoon. Preoccupied, Carter remains fixated on his food, ignorant of our conversation. We chat for a few minutes, nothing in particular aside from her life and aspirations with helping others, while Peachman takes his time. He enters several trance-like states, burning holes into the surrounding walls before continuing with another bite. Natalie excuses herself to use the washroom, and I am left to sit in silence with Carter, the world outside violent as the rain crashes onto the roof. Droplets sprinkle the window, racing each other to the bottom, while others clash, creating a mass, moving nowhere. Carter breaks from the outside, wondering about his sandwich and how much longer it will take. I look down at his plate to find crumbs. Confused, he shakes his head in disbelief before Natalie enters to calm him, assuring he'll get his lunch soon. After a few moments, the scene passes, with him thankful, and we're back in the living room. As we sit across from each other, it takes a couple minutes for him to grasp the space, my speech slowing to match his processing. The time is infuriating to sit through, though for him it is a minute instead of 10. A few meandering stories commence, amounting to not much of interest as I drift into boredom. I wrangle for questions to ask, and his answers twist into their own meanings as though my input is invalid. For the first time, he notices something is off, and as he lights a cigarette before taking a deep breath in, he asks me, "Why are you here?" I shake my head, bewildered, and ask him if he understands what we're doing, to which he acknowledges me, so I reiterate my purpose. He remains still, waiting for me to answer, and I repeat myself. No other word is spoken by him until he stamps his cigarette and huffs, "I'm tired." I turn to call for Natalie, but he stops me, assuring me he can continue for a little while longer, patting at his pockets for something I am unsure of. Flipping through my notes, I search for a question to ask, but am stumped. My eyes divert back to him glancing around the room again, taking in everything for the first time, before asking to put on a record for him. Getting up from the couch, I search for a record and put it on, the melody filling the air with joy, yet he sulks. Consoling, I grab his hand and ask what's wrong, though remain stiff and silent, causing my eyes to well. An excruciating pause before saying he can't hear it, that the music is jumbled and flows through his head like an automobile accident. "Look at me," he whispers. "Can't control my emotions." He releases a heavy sigh and reverts back, awareness fading, and as I sink again into the couch, I blurt out with no more than a thought, "How did your wife's death affect your work?" He gives me a smile, his teeth stained from the nicotine, and laughs, catching me off guard as I jump back, sinking lower. "A funny man you are," he bellowed from the depths of his smoke-covered lungs. I promise him I am not being funny, but to no avail, as he continues his tirade directed at my amusing antics. First, he dives into a story he was writing, the premise of his 1936 film, The Cane, before explaining the whereabouts of Meredith. I reiterate to him that he is mistaken, which is followed by the loudest screech I have ever heard escaping from a man, sending Natalie to rush to his side. Through short, obtrusive breaths, he pleads for me to stop my charade. In his stupor, his mind races, and as he continues, his words mash together, creating incoherent statements and phrases meaning nothing to anybody. My heart pounds with guilt. Natalie turns to me, with fear and resentment growing in her eyes, and asks me to leave. I stand outside the door. The fresh rain that continues to fall is crisp and fills my lungs in an attempt to fix the hole where my soul was. It is November 25th, 1951, and I am watching a dead man eat. What is left of Carter Peachman, the writer, the storyteller, the man, sits at the dining room table, mouth agape. His face is blank, no longer expressive, and his hair, brittle, falls out with as much as a gentle breeze. Natalie pushes her chair beside him, feeding him soup. My heart sinks. How to eat, speak, walk, clean himself. All have been wiped from his mind. And the one thing known to him and others, gone. I move into the room and take a seat across from the two of them. Peachman's eyes follow, though he does not move his head. A knot forms in my throat as I watch the scene before me, unable to conjure any thoughts of my own. For 30 minutes, I sit with them, while speaking with Natalie about nothing in particular, until the soup is gone and we move into the living room. The sun peeks through the window Carter is stopped in front of, the rays illuminating the dark floor, revealing the heavy dust. Birds perched on the windowsill release their serenade for the world, but no one is listening. 4 months pass, and a great deal of change so sudden thrusts Peachman into a state unfathomable to most. At times, Natalie tells me, he grows the strength to make a sound, seemingly unprompted, but reverts to silence, as though a chemical burst in his brain flutters just as quickly as it comes, sending it back into darkness. There is nothing else to do, she continues, but keep him comfortable. Alcoholism, unfair wages, constantly moving due to finances, watching his wife die in front of him. Comfortability is something never in Carter's life. But as I watch the man, celebrated for his imaginative mind, lean back in his wheelchair, staring at nothing and incapable of distinguishing anything, I cry. The mind is a cruel mistress, and Carter Peachman is its latest victim. There are many like him, and many that will be taken. Will I suffer such a fate? Our greatest asset in life is the mind, and holding on to each inch of it is imperative to survival. Survival for life, but also for the mundane. Now, the mundane is everything to him, the droning silence being all that is known, a bliss beyond the deteriorating world, left now to fade, as a memory and a life. I get up from the couch, choking on my tears, and make way towards the record player and fill the air with warm familiarity from an era removed. Yet, Carter Peachman remains staring out that window, unaware of it all.